Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 63, and today we're going to talk about problems, but specifically about how we use the lens of problems to organize IP work. Before we start, unfortunately, we're going to take a moment of silence because not all of the hostages are back yet. Okay, so problems and organizing principle in IP. Let me give you a few examples of how problems run all through our organization. Customers, not clients, customers have problems. A startup tries to solve that problem that their customers have, and they have their own problems trying to solve it. An IP strategist needs to decide what problem the IP should relate to. A patent attorney needs to talk about technical problems. Somebody who's buying the startup will pay more if the startup solves their particular problem than if they solve a generic problem. Competitors are a problem. We want to make problems for the competitors. We'll see below that identifying and having experience with problems is actually a competitive advantage for a company. And when we talk about problems, the type of IP that is relevant to is at least patents, trade secrets, know-how, and even branding. So problems are everywhere and really help organize our work. What is a problem? Dictionary says a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful and needing to be dealt with and overcome. Okay? ChatGPT, after reading most of these slides, says that a problem is what happens when you try to do something real and you hit a wall. And happily, he says, it's an obstacle that forces invention, strategy, and law, I don't know why, to take shape. In any case, it creates a condition for invention, and we're all about invention. So we see that a problem relates to some sort of practical barrier, and questions can make you take action and be interested. So questions are important, but a problem is what you have. And that's the kind of problems we're going to talk about. And I just want to note, I'll talk about it more later. I'm going to talk about problems because everybody in IP talks about problems. But what we should really be interested in, especially in startup companies, is opportunities. So basically, our clients should have opportunities and our competitors should have problems. Let's zoom in perhaps on three different aspects where IP plays a part and problems are meaningful. So IP practice is basically what, patent attorneys do all day. A problem is usually described as a technical problem, and the solution of the technical problem, you want it to be inventive. You get an office action, your client immediately says, we have a problem. You draft an application, that is what's called a wicked problem, which doesn't have a simple, straightforward solution. And in fact, the more you play with it, the more it changes. Okay, so just think about one aspect. A typical application might be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 pages long. But if we really did what we wanted, every application would be 300 pages long. And that still wouldn't be enough. You have to decide what you're not putting in, but whatever you don't put in causes other issues. When you think about IP strategy, first of all, a lot of companies exist in order to solve a problem. And the job of IP is to support that company, which might mean create problems for other people, might mean solve problems. Further for IP strategy, if a company, and I said that before, but it bears saying again, if a company is solving a problem of a specific potential acquirer, that adds more value to the startup. And of course, we want to encourage that problem or protect the solutions to the problem using IP. Another case where IP relates to problems in IP strategy. Let's say I have a company, and we're going to have that example later on, that treats a disease using a pill when the other solutions, such as diet. A company has more value if the IP blocks the other solutions which are completely different from your solution. So the problem is not some sort of technical problem, but a more general clinical problem. Now, when we talk about competition, a problem can be a moat, something the competitor wants to do but can't get past. And the way problems can be a moat is not only if they have a problem, but if they can't even see the right problem to solve and or don't know how to solve them. You do a lot of that using trade secrets and know-how and so on. And of course, you can cause problems using IP. So we always think about, I write a patent and they're infringing it, but the very fact that they don't know if they're infringing creates FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And any problems a competitor might have becomes even more wicked when they have to factor in this FUD. And IP is really good for doing that. You've probably already noticed that IP interacts a lot with problems. How? It can help define solutions. It can judge what solutions are protectable and how well they're protectable. Mentioned multiple times, create problems for others. It can protect solutions or block solutions, or it can guide you or other people to get to certain solutions. Problems are a resource, perhaps even IP, to help you understand an issue or a technology. Problems help generate IP, not just one type of IP and not just once. If you look at problems a company has or problems with obtaining IP, these are a guide for generating the IP strategy. And last but not least, problems can be a trap also for you. If you think that you only have to solve one problem, you're not going to generate all the IP that your company needs. Are problems a type of IP? I say they are. Not legally. There's no legal protections for problems. In fact, problems are not usually acclaimed. Wow, this guy found this big problem, okay? Sometimes founders get a lot of respect for having identified a problem that people haven't seen before, but often engineers inside a company don't get as much respect. So I hear that some companies do give a lot of respect to the engineers and perhaps even bonuses to engineers which identify problems. The patent law expects you to publish your problems. Okay, it doesn't give protection, but it expects you to publish them. At the very least, the problem should be implicit in your patent, but in some countries, they actually expect the problem to be well, or at least a little bit, written out in your patent document. Let's think about academia for a second. We know that research questions are important, and the last book, I forget the name, the popular book about Tversky and other guy, all came up because of a problem that they had. They couldn't match up how they were acting with how the series said they should be acting. So it's a great research problem. It spawned many careers, long careers. It was wonderful. But people don't celebrate problems. The particular researcher who has a generative problem is very proud of it because it means they're going to have work forever. And I believe that it's less common for researchers to steal a problem one from another because the best they can do is be like the other researcher. In any case, IP law does not recognize problems as being valuable, even if the problems have folded inside of them all sorts of insights. However, I believe IP is problems are very valuable IP, and you should be protecting them. I'll explain a bit more later. It's not easy, but you need to try to do it. What is a problem in a company? So even when you talk about a single invention, usually there's a whole ladder of problems, and I say ladder because it's not exactly different level of abstractions, but different levels of what's of interest. And each one of these levels can have IP aimed at it. Let me give you an example. GLP-1 agonist oral pills. You know, today you have the Osmic, and you can inject it once a week. And earlier drugs you inject once a day. A company comes in and they have a pill. You just swallow the pill once a day instead of injecting yourself. What problem are they solving? Traditionally, they would say the problem we're solving is how to selectively block GLP-1. And we have a solution, a pill that does it. And we have a new formulation, you know, that's inventive. But there's also a clinical problem that they're solving. Compliance. People don't like injecting themselves, and taking a pill is much easier to convince them to do. And that problem has a sub-problem, which is side effects. Why don't people comply with injections? Part of it is because they have side effects. If you take a pill, you feel much more control over whether you'll have the side effects or not. If you take an injection once a week, you can't suddenly stop on day 4. If you're taking pills, you can stop. There's also a convenience problem. Okay, it's in a completely different part of the arena. GLP-1 needs to be stored in, agonists need to be stored in the refrigerator, at least until you open them. Pills don't. This startup has a business problem. There's a lot of competition. It has a financial problem. Some of this competition is able to spend a lot of money on marketing and distribution. How are you going to beat them? And guess what? There's also an IP problem. How broad protection can I get for an oral pill when there's so many different other formulations out there, and I can only get protection for the particular formulations that I give? And there's an M&A problem. How do I make sure this startup is the one that is bought and not some other startup which is doing something similar? Okay, so we have here multiple levels of problems in one company, in one invention, in one product, and each one of these levels usually has more than just the one problem that I gave here, and each one of them has sub-problems. What do we do about all of these problems? So easiest solution is to silo them. I'm going to solve this problem, this problem, this problem, each one separately. From an IP perspective, don't do it. Why not? Because valuable IP arises exactly where the problems interact. Sometimes they interact with each other, and sometimes the solutions for the problems interact. And sometimes the customer's problem and the company's problem interact. And if you use design thinking or other problem solving methods, you discover that maybe you can modify the customer's problem and modify the company's problem so that they match better and solution is much easier. So you shouldn't silo your problems, even though it's a lot and complicated. But I want to give you a different view of problems that you might have. When the company has a problem, if it's not a competitive advantage, as I'll describe later, it's basically going to waste resources. If a customer has a problem, it's a market. He has a problem, we solve it, he gives money. If a competitor has a problem, that appears to be an advantage because the competitor can't do what they want, so we can move along. Sometimes. I've given a talk about day zero and imagine that all GLP-1 agonists walking in before they actually have a company. How do I look at them through the lens of a problem? So often what I do is I tell them to explain just 4 points. 1, what is the problem you're solving? 2, how did others solve it? 3, what special insight do you have? And 4, how do you implement your insight? Okay, this is really basis for writing a patent. What's interesting is that most clients that come in talk about the technical problem. We just had one today. But what's going through my head is not the technical problem, because that's what I do for a living. New inventions, writing patents. Usually, you can get a patent. The problems that are more interesting are the business problems, and the questions that is more interesting is how can IP help solve, support, leverage, whatever these problems. Why is it so important? Because these other problems, these real problems, will be solved by somebody. And if they're not solved by you and that somebody gets IP, it's going to be unpleasant. And these problems will come up, and they might come up just before an investor agrees to give money. If these problems are problems the competitors might have, we can get very useful IP. The same people that look at the problems they're solving as a technical problem tend to feel that the job of IP is to prevent other people from copying their technical solution. When, of course, IP by its nature is about preventing other people from doing what they want. And last but not least, some of the real problems a company has are IP problems. Maybe you can't get useful patents. Maybe there's a big FTO problem. So there's a kind of disconnect between how many clients look at problems and how I do and recommend looking at problems. But I showed you how many different problems even a simple company can have, so it's not surprising. Sometimes people who have a problem go to a professional. And while we're not lawyers, they might treat us as lawyers and assume that whatever problems they have is automatically solved by application of the relevant IP law. So here's a classical method of legal reasoning. You collect the facts, you identify legal issues, you select the relevant law, you apply the law to the facts, and then you improve whatever it is that you made. Should we use IP law for problem solving? I say no. IP law is meant to solve a problem, but not the type of problems that startups have. On the other hand, the law does create affordances, things that the law didn't exactly mean to give you, perhaps, which we can definitely take advantages of when we're doing what we're doing. So what I suggest is you look at problems as engineering issues. In engineering, you know where you want to be. Maybe you want to have a monopoly. You know how you might get there. For example, where you can roadblock your competitors from providing a matching product. You know what tools, the law is a tool. So we know what laws could help. And then we find weaknesses in what we want to do and strengths where perhaps we can apply the law, maybe by filing a patent. So till now, I've been talking generally about how IP and problems are besties. let's give a few examples of how we really deal with problems on a daily basis. So in Europe, especially, but not only, they like using the problem solution approach. And basically, it's a straightforward method. You identify the closest prior art, then you determine the objective technical problem which is not solved by this closest prior art. Then you identify this delta which the invention is adding, which does solve the problem, and then you evaluate whether or not it's obvious. Okay, cool. What I want you to notice is that the problem is defining what the invention is and what inventiveness means. Okay, so identifying the problem, understanding the problem seems to be critical for understanding the invention. This also means that when you talk about a generic problem, and European examiners love doing it, oh, basically the problem, also in China, basically the problem to be solved is a different way of providing weight loss. Okay? So I gave you all of these problems the startup has, and the examiner just said, oh, it's a generic issue. That type of problem doesn't have any specificity, and it can't really help you do anything. In fact, a lot of times, the invention is in reimagining the problem itself, reframing the problem, and in particular, understanding what exactly needs to be solved. The whole thing needs to be solved, or just some particular part. And why is this especially important for IP? First of all, because this delta usually doesn't solve the entire problem. If you can identify what you want to solve, it's better. When you start from the closest prior art, it automatically ties you to the past, which is bad, interferes with thinking about the future. But on the other hand, it helps prevent hindsight. On the other hand, a bit octopus today, when you look at the problem, it blinds you from opportunities. Okay? Companies are about opportunities, not about problems. But having said all of this, the problem solution approach is definitely something which you should use if you're stuck, because it will help you tease out at least part of what the invention might be. But I believe only if you spend a significant amount of work on defining what the problem is. Okay, so I talked about problem solution. How do I see it? The way I see it is you have a situation. In the situation, you identify problems. Then you have an insight about the problem, because problems are usually too complicated to think about, but the insight reframes them, reformulates them. Then you have some sort of idea about how that problem could be solved or taken advantage of. Then you have some inklings, some directions. Then you start putting together parts of the solution. Then you have a whole solution, and then you fix it up, and then you have to do the whole thing over again because the usual reasons. It doesn't have to be linear, but it's a more nuanced view of the parts. And what's important for us at each one of these stages can be used as a target for IP. So I can file a patent which will prevent the competitors from identifying the problem in the situation. I can file a patent on one of the parts of the solution. I can perhaps file a patent the minute I have some sort of inkling on what the solution might look like. And each one of these can be looked at multiple abstraction levels. If we look at the situation obese people, situation, people that don't like injectors, the situation, people who are scared of side effects, the situation that there's money on the table in treating this and we'd like to make more money. And what's interesting, I believe, is that you can usually assume that your competitor will also take a certain path, maybe not exactly this one, maybe not exactly the one you will take to reach a solution. To the extent that you can guess what path they're going to take, you can block it. To the extent that they might get enlightenment by looking at what you did, you should block it or confuse them so they don't know what you did. If you know what the end solution is going to look like, well, obviously we're going to file IP on that. And this also lets us understand a little bit about why levels of abstraction matter, because if their technical solution or if their technical problem is different from your technical problem and technical solution, then what we looked at before with the problem solution approach will be useless. Okay, if your technical problem is how to make a formulation stable at room temperature in solid form, and they are making a spray which is liquid, your technical problem is not relevant to them, and any IP you get will not block them. And that's why I'm saying again, focusing on the technical aspect of the problem is a trap. It needs to be done, but it's not the most important thing. How do other people often solve problems? Problems are very complicated. They choose a niche. We're not going to treat everybody. We're only going to treat middle-aged women between 50 and 65, actually the biggest market. Then we want to write niche-specific IP, which takes into account a particular problem. And sometimes the solution is a trade-off. We get more of this and less of that. You can file IP in order to change the trade-off that your competitor will make. They think they can make the trade-off over here, but you just added IP, which causes problems, and now the trade-off moves to a different place. Started off by saying that opportunities are more interesting than problems, and maybe I will give a talk on how opportunities are an organizing principle. But to the extent that you're a typical patent attorney and you're attracted to problems because that's what you deal with all day, then you must consider opportunities as an organizing principle in order to balance your natural attraction to problems. How do you know that you're attracted to problems? Because you look at the problem as a pain and the solution as a painkiller. It makes the pain go away. Let's just talk about the classical example, which might not be true, that for a set of people had told him if you would have asked people what they want, they would have said they want a faster horse. Well, if you come to somebody and say, I want a faster horse, we'll make better horseshoes, we'll make better whips, we're going to do selective breeding to get faster horses. We're not going to get automobiles. If you formulate your problem as a gap, I'm here, but I want to be there. If anybody saw Sesame Street, then you have to define where it is that you want to be. The minute I'm demanding for you to define where it is that you want to be, it forces you, gives you the opportunity at least, to think of the opportunity where you want to be. Another way to break out of this problem view is to think about the affordances of the solution. Okay, a solution does stuff, but it also makes things possible. If you're a T-Rex and you're covered with feathers, that's good for you, it gives you insulation and so on, but it might also mean that one of your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will become a bird that uses the feathers in order to fly. So the feathers were not created for flight, but they create the affordance for flight. In any case, if you identify the problem, you get insights into the shape of the problem space, and these insights can be really valuable. Let me give you an example of our daily life. You get an office action. Well, you can look at it as a problem. It's going to cost the client money. The patent office says we don't have patentability. Maybe we'll solve it by giving the client, we'll charge them less, and maybe we'll manage to find a way to make it patentable. But in reality, an office action is actually an opportunity to make sure that the patent you get is the patent that you need. not a problem, it's a situation with an opportunity. Last but not least, you might have noticed my quote before. When the client identifies the problem, it is absolutely an opportunity for valuable IP. Okay, so when clients tell me, listen, we have a problem, I start drooling because that's what we're about. You have problems, so will your competitors. Here's another example of a typical attorney task. Reading, okay? Somebody gives you a patent to read. Long, complicated, technical document. But most documents that we deal with are purposeful. Whoever wrote them has a reason. There's also a reason why we're reading. So usually these documents, and especially patents, are written around the problem that they're trying to solve or trying to deal with. The minute you realize that this complicated 40-column patent is actually about a particular problem, the structure of that document and the content and the slant that they have when they're talking about things becomes much clearer. And one of the things that you get is a kind of filter. Part of what they wrote in the patent was because the client wanted to write it, and part of what they wrote is because it relates specifically to the problem being solved. Now, it depends why you're reading the document, but once you know the structure and you know what you're looking for, it's much easier. And in fact, a lot of people who draft patent applications emphasize what problems they have. And when they talk about an embodiment, they say which category or subcategory of these problems they're actually solving. Okay, what about when we write a patent application? I'm saying don't be tempted to use this simple logic of identify the problem being solved, draft claims to how you solve it, and add details to the extent that you need. It's good, okay, it passes a minimum bar, but the problems that you identified is going to evolve and otherwise change. Other people are not going to see the same problem and they're not going to see it the same way. And they might also have other problems and other solutions. And guess what? We're writing the patent in order to block them, not in order to cover the problem we identified today. Get back to the question, how do we break out of the problem view? So one way is we look at the solution. Does the solution that we invented create affordances? What is it good for? What is the essence of parts of the solution? Maybe they're also good for something. You talk about the problem, maybe we only need to talk about part of the problem. When we solve the problem, it will create ripples. Ripples are really other problems and opportunities in other places. Bottom line is, when you draft a patent application, you should work hard not to get trapped by the problem view. It's very seductive. I don't want to use the word easy, but it really helps organize your thinking if you do it. So please don't. Problems can also tell us when we should draft. You can see on LinkedIn a lot of discussions on whether you should file an application only after you have a product or before. So maybe you need a product, or at least a solution that you proved works, or at least a complete solution, or at least part of the solution. Now, when innovation moves quickly, any of these options can be too slow. I say the opposite. If you understand the problem, or at least part of the problem, and maybe how the problem might evolve, you should already talk about drafting. It is quite possible that putting aside the question of publishing the solution, the problem, we can identify partial solutions which are enabled today. And sometimes we can identify critical partial solutions. For example, before the iPhone was ready, Steve Jobs knew that he wanted something that would fit in a pocket. He told his engineers to do it, okay? It immediately became clear when he walked around with it in his pocket, with a prototype, that the screen might get scratched. So he needs a special kind of glass, Gorilla Glass. And he got it just in time after a lot of pushing on Corning. But the patent could have been written at that instant when he realized that there's a problem if you put a phone in your pocket and the whole phone is a screen, and the screen is critical for the quality. What do you do about it? And instead of talking about what did I invent, you can start talking about what is the adjacent possible. Things that are next to what we know how to do, maybe a little step will get us there. Another issue that us patent attorneys deal with all the time is abstraction. We have to decide what abstractions we're going to talk about in the patent application. And I'm suggesting that a useful abstraction for a patent attorney, forget about a lot of other issues, is an abstraction that says something valuable about a problem, about a solution, or about the interplay. And abstractions are about part of the problem, not about the whole problem. But in the end, when you've understood the problems and the solutions and generated abstractions, what you've actually done is created a language for any particular patent application that you're talking about. Okay, if the issue is size, the issue is not 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters. Okay, we're talking, let's say, about an endoscope. So which office can that endoscope comfortably fit in? So it's not the numbers that matter, not the size that matters, but the particular places that can be put in. And of course, lest you get tempted to use these problems in a problem solution situation, any problem defined this way has a lot of hindsight in it. So definitely don't write about it in the background of the application. Any problem that you define after you understand the invention has hindsight in it. Problems change. So what? Besides the fact that we want, block all of them and so on, what you really get is a chain of problems or a tree of problems. And if your company stays stuck on the first problem, that's it. One of the things you need to do if you're dealing with problems is ask yourself, how quickly will these problems change? Or say differently, can you tell me when this problem will still matter? And of course, some problems are actually stable. We can assume people will still be getting headaches over the next 20 years, but some of them only appear to be stable. Okay. For example, what do we do about being shut up for COVID? In year 2020, maybe we thought it would be forever, but it turned out that it wasn't. One of the things that means that the process of drafting a patent application is really a search, an intentional search for problems and what the change of problems looks like. One of the ways we can look at it is when we look at the interplay between the problem space and the solution space. Problem space is, I want to be here, I want to be there. And solution space is where can I actually make an offering? And when you look at the two of them, as IP people, it tells us where we should put, I called it mines, little pieces of IP that when the competitor steps on them, they get blown up. And this is what I've always believed, but then I found articles, there's a link earlier, where he says that actually, when you do a design process, it's not exactly clear what is the problem space and what is the solution space. So I don't know what to do with it, but I did want to tell you. And one of the places where you see it is where you talk about co-evolution. As a problem is solved, you get a solution, but then you get new problems. So sometimes the problem causes a problem, but sometimes the problem causes a solution, which causes the problem. And wicked problems, which I mentioned before, of the kind that when you squeeze in one place, they pop up in somewhere else. You can look at it the other way. When you play with a wicked problem and see how it reacts, it helps you understand better how you should frame the problem and where IP might be valuable. Problems are not only IPs, an actual company resource. And there's this interesting article by Roger Martin about the next room problem. We have a company, it's in a room, a market. Where's the next market is going to be in? What does it look like? The answer is, if you have a handle on the problems, you can map out and decorate that next room before your competitors do. As long as your competitors are following you, they don't know where you're going to go next. But if you have a mechanism and access to the questions and problems that people have, you can do that. And we see it in a lot of startups that while they say they're trying to solve the problem, they're actually on a journey leapfrogging from problem to problem until they find the real problem that needs to be solved. So if your company has experience with the problem, that's a very important mechanism for generating IP. And it's also good for driving adaptability. And you ask, okay, what can I do about it? Well, all sorts of deception things we've spoken about before, like hiding and misleading others on critical issues, can help prevent your competition from understanding what problems they should be looking at. Okay, I promised to get back to this question. How do we protect problems, which are not really IP, legally, using IP tools? So here's a few thoughts, not perfect. Number one, trade secrets. If people don't know the problem exists, don't know the details, don't understand it. Problem is you can't always keep these things a secret. Then there's know-how. And know-how has a few friends, know why, know who, know what. And dealing with the problem requires all of them. The problem with all of these knows is that they can just walk out the door. Okay, the people who know how and know who can go to the competitor tomorrow. Patents. You can't patent the problem, but you can patent the solutions and you can patent the tools that you need in order to analyze or deal with the patent. Problem with patents, they get published and they might give away your problem without giving you enough protection. Complicated problems, use software to manage them. That's protected by copyright. Finding problems and dealing with problems needs data. Data is also difficult to protect, but it has different difficulties from problems. Something I call team how. Okay, know-how is something that I know how to do, but what if it's something that my team knows how to do? What if it's a whole culture of my company and how they deals with things, like in Zappos? After you get accepted, they give you $1,000 to leave. Okay, so the whole orientation of the company, there's jargon, there's attitude, there's aesthetic. Okay, that is really, really difficult for other people to copy. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes they buy you. And even when they buy you, it doesn't always transfer. The downside is it takes time to build that. In any case, problems are dynamic, the world is dynamic, so the way that you're protecting your problems also needs to be changed. And in particular, you want to protect the mechanisms that you use that have to do with the dynamics of problems. How do you generate them? How do you detect them? How do you talk to them? And so on. Why is it interesting where problems come from? Because we want to prevent a competition from getting there. So just a short list, you can get it from observation of data. You can get it from thinking about the future. Usually the way to prevent other people from doing this is keeping secrets, not publishing. In patents, not giving away what the problem is. And I'll say it again, reformulating and reframing a problem is a critical act for a company. It usually takes more than 5 minutes. but it is extremely difficult to keep secret. And even if you sign somebody on an NDA, once you change the ways they look at the world, which is exactly what this is, it can't be unseen. So you have to be doubly careful about that. Few types of problems I like talking about: internal and external problems. External problems, everybody has. The IP is usually too broad. For example, how do you hydrate people? You can give them a cup of water. You can give them an IV. Lots of ways. And so many people do it that a lot of the people who are doing it are not even your competitors. However, since your protection probably won't cover everybody, your patent application, when it publishes, will definitely, or your product, will definitely inspire your competition. Internal problems are ones that you have because you chose a particular solution. We chose to hydrate using glass cups. So now we have a question: how do we manufacture glass cups at a low price? That's a problem only we have. People making ceramic pots, they don't have that problem. Good? Yeah, people can't completely directly with you, but the IP, while it might help other people, will not block anybody who's not an exact competitor of what you're doing. And of course, you have something in the middle, so that's obvious. Hidden problems. People like ignoring problems or avoiding them or not knowing about them. It's especially an issue when we talk about freedom to operate, but it's also an issue, and I've had this, the company wants to pretend that a certain class of problems doesn't exist. And they want to pretend it because they have a marketing message or because they're talking to regulatory authorities. And then they tell you, you can't file a patent on how to solve such and such a problem because our company dogma is that that problem doesn't exist. Until suddenly it does, and it's too late. Okay, so in conclusion, problems are not just obstacles. They help organize a lot of what we do. You have to be very comfortable with problems, and I said plural because any trivial situation has many different problems. Problems themselves are valuable IP. They're valuable for competitive advantage. I use problems, but think about them as opportunities. And remember that the best thing to do with problems is to give them to your competitor, but not in a way that will make them develop a better solution, but rather in a way that will make them fold upon themselves. Give you an example of how this could happen for you. Let's say you work for Shimano. Shimano make bicycle parts. It's a world leader. They put you in charge of the division that makes bicycle chains. And they tell you, here's your budget, maintain leadership. So you can't just focus on technical problems. So what problems should you focus on? And even if these problems are common problems, should you just take a standard definition or should you personalize it? And what IP should you write and when? Okay, I'm stopping the recording.